Oak Haven, California sat at the bottom of a forgotten valley like a stone dropped into still water, sending no ripples outward, drawing no attention from the world beyond its jagged mountain borders. The desert winds came down from the eastern ranges every afternoon, hot and gritty, carrying the smell of dry sage and dying fields. The agricultural land that had once made the valley prosperous had been quietly purchased, consolidated, and left deliberately fallow by men who found it more profitable to own dirt than to grow anything in it. The town itself had the exhaustion of a place that had stopped expecting better things. The storefronts along Main Street wore their faded paint like old scars. The single traffic light at the center of town blinked yellow after 9 in the evening, as if even the infrastructure had given up trying. The railroad tracks that bisected Oak Haven from north to south were the most honest thing about the place. They didn't pretend. They simply divided the town into what it actually was, two separate worlds, forced to share the same valley air and the same zip code and almost nothing else. North of the tracks, the houses had stone facades and three-car garages and landscape lawns that stayed green through August on expensive irrigation systems. The Rourke family lived up there, at the end of a private road behind iron gates in a house that was less a home than a declaration. South of the tracks, the houses had aluminum siding gone gray and carports instead of garages and lawns that the summer heat killed without mercy every year. The trailer parks anchored the southern end of town like an afterthought, rows of narrow homes pressed together under old cottonwood trees. Their residents moving through the rhythms of shift work and unpaid bills and the dignity of people who have learned to need very little. Reese Mitchell lived in a pale yellow house on Decker Street, 2 blocks south of the tracks, in a neighborhood where the street lights worked on a rotating schedule of neglect. The house had 3 rooms and a bathroom with a shower that ran cold for the first 4 minutes every morning without exception. The front porch sagged on the left side, where the support post had begun to rot, and Reese had learned to step over that spot without thinking about it. The way you learn to navigate all the small failures of a home you cannot afford to fix. She had been navigating those failures her entire life. Her father had left when she was still too young to hold his face clearly in her memory. What remained of him was not an image, but a feeling, the absence that shapes a child more thoroughly than presence ever could. Her mother, Sarah, did not speak of him. Sarah Mitchell was a woman who had made a private peace with the things she could not change, and she applied that same quiet stoicism to her illness, to the mounting medical bills, to the slow erosion of the life she had imagined for herself and her daughter. Sarah had been diagnosed with a chronic autoimmune condition when Reese was 11 years old. The disease moved through her body in waves, sometimes retreating for months at a time into something almost manageable, then surging back with a cruelty that left her bedridden for weeks. The medications that kept her functional were expensive in the way that necessary things always seem to be expensive for people who can least afford them. The part-time administrative job Sarah held at a local insurance office covered the rent and the utilities and the groceries if they were careful. It did not cover the medications. That gap in the budget had become Reese's responsibility without anyone ever formally assigning it to her. It had simply happened the way responsibility accrues in households where there is only one adult, and that adult is diminishing. Reese had started working at the diner on Route 9 the summer she turned 15. The place was called Harlan's, though Harlan himself had been dead for 11 years, and the current owner, a humorless man named Bud Castor, had never bothered to change the sign. The diner occupied a low concrete building set back from the highway, its parking lot cracked and uneven, its interior smelling permanently of fried oil and burnt coffee, and the sweetness of industrial cleaning solution. The vinyl booths were patched with electrical tape in colors that no longer matched the original upholstery. The jukebox in the corner had not worked since the previous decade. Reese worked 30 hours a week there, 5 days out of 7, arriving before school when the early shift needed coverage, and staying until midnight on the weekends when the kitchen ran long. She flipped burgers and wiped down counters and refilled salt shakers and carried plates of food to people who rarely looked at her directly, and she took her hourly wage home in an envelope and gave the larger portion of it to Sarah without discussion. She was 17 years old, and she had the stillness that belongs to people who have spent their formative years watching rather than acting. Her eyes were brown and attentive, missing nothing. She was tall for her age, lean in the way of someone who eats adequately, but not abundantly, with dark hair. She kept pulled back during shifts because Bud Caster had opinions about hair near the food. She had learned to be invisible, not passively, but as a cultivated skill, refined through repetition and discipline, and the understanding that in Oak Haven, the invisible people were the ones who made it through the week without incident. She did not raise her voice. She did not draw attention. She worked her shifts and went home and sat with her mother in the evenings and did her homework at the kitchen table under the single overhead light, and she planned in the vague and stubborn way of people who refuse to stop planning for something beyond the yellow house on Decker Street. It was a Tuesday evening in late September, about 20 minutes before closing, when Chloe Miller first came into the diner. Reese noticed her immediately, not because the girl made a scene she did not, but because the diner had 7 regulars at that hour, and this was not one of them. The girl was 16 maybe, with dark hair cut bluntly at the jaw and dark eyes that moved around the room the way eyes move when they are accustomed to assessing exits. She wore a denim jacket that had been washed too many times. The color faded from indigo to a pale blue-gray, and she carried a paperback novel pressed against her chest like a small shield. She slid into the back corner booth, the one furthest from the windows, furthest from the door, and she opened the book and held it in front of her face, and Reese understood immediately that she was not actually reading it. Reese brought her a menu. The girl waved it away without looking up. Reese brought her a glass of water. The girl wrapped both hands around it and stared at the table. Reese went back behind the counter and watched from the periphery of her attention, noting without staring, cataloging without commenting. After a few minutes, she cut a slice of the cherry pie that had been sitting in the case since the afternoon and poured a cup of black coffee and carried both to the corner booth and set them down without a word. The girl looked up from the book she wasn't reading. She looked at the pie and then at Reese and then at the pie again. "You're going to get fired," she said. Her voice was low and flat and carried the cadence of someone who has spent a long time keeping their voice from giving things away. "My boss is asleep in the back office," Reese said. She wasn't lying. Bud Caster fell asleep in his office chair every Tuesday night at 9:45, with the reliability of a man who had made peace with his routines. Besides, Reese added, glancing at the untouched glass of water, "You look like you need it." The girl held her gaze for a moment. Then she looked back down at the book that was not being read. But she pulled the pie toward her and ate it in small, deliberate bites, and she drank the coffee while it was still hot. And when she left 40 minutes later, she left $2 on the table, even though nothing had been charged to her. She came back the following Tuesday, and the Tuesday after that. Her name was Chloe Miller, and Reese learned this the way she learned most things, gradually, without pushing by, being the kind of person that information eventually gravitates toward, simply because she never demanded it. Chloe told her on the 3rd Tuesday in the way of a person disclosing a condition rather than offering a greeting. "I'm Chloe Miller. My father is Clayton Miller. People call him Crow." She said it the way you might say, "I am carrying something very heavy, and I have been carrying it for a long time." Reese nodded and refilled her coffee and did not change her expression, and something in Chloe's posture shifted very slightly, the way a door shifts when a long-held pressure against it is finally removed. Everyone in Oak Haven knew the name Clayton Crow Miller. His reputation did not require introduction or elaboration. He was the sergeant-at-arms for the California Charter of the Hells Angels, a position that carried the specific weight of enforced consequence. He was a man in his mid-40s who had survived things that would have ended lesser men, and the survival had left its marks on him in the form of prison ink that covered both arms from wrist to shoulder, and a stillness about his face that people instinctively recognized as dangerous. He rode a custom Harley-Davidson that sounded like low-flying aircraft when he throttled it through the valley streets. When he dropped Chloe at school in the mornings, the parking lot would quiet in the way of people who understand without being told that they are in the presence of something they should not disturb. The unwritten rule of Oak Haven was simple. You did not look at Crow Miller's motorcycle, and you absolutely did not look at Crow Miller's daughter. The rule existed not because Crow had ever articulated it, but because the town had absorbed the principle through collective instinct. Chloe moved through Oak Haven in a bubble of enforced distance, respected the way high-voltage lines are respected not with affection, but with a careful awareness of what proximity could cost you. Reese looked, not out of recklessness and not out of ignorance. She looked because she saw behind the bubble and the enforced distance and the posture Chloe had perfected to keep the world at arm's length, a girl who was profoundly alone. And Reese Mitchell understood loneliness with an intimacy that made her recognize it in others, the way you recognize your native language spoken in a foreign place instantly, and with a complicated mixture of solidarity and grief. Their friendship grew in the only direction available to it, which was slowly and quietly, and in the margins of Tuesday evenings between 9 and 11. Chloe told her about what it was like to be the daughter of a man whose name made rooms go silent, about the way people treated her like a category rather than a person, either avoiding her entirely or approaching her with the falseness of people who wanted something from her father, about the suffocating weight of the club's protection, which was real and which kept her safe, and which also made her feel on most days like a valuable object stored behind glass. She was not allowed to want things outside the boundaries her father had established for her safety. She was not allowed to be ordinary. She was not allowed to be invisible, which was the one thing she sometimes desperately wanted to be. Reese listened. She did not offer advice or perspective or the relentless cheerfulness that people often deploy against other people's pain. She listened the way she did everything else, completely without performance. And in exchange, she offered Chloe something no one else in Oak Haven had managed to offer her, the experience of being seen as simply herself without the weight of her father's name reshaping the interaction. October moved into November, and the desert cold arrived the way it always did in the valley suddenly, and without apology, dropping the temperature 15 degrees in the span of a single weekend. The cottonwood trees along the south end of town shed their leaves in dry, rattling cascades. The fields turned from brown to gray. Reese added an extra layer under her diner uniform and started keeping a spare pair of wool socks in her locker. And life in Oak Haven continued with the grinding consistency that she had come to think of as its defining characteristic. The trouble arrived wearing expensive boots. Trent Rourke was 19 years old and had never in his life encountered a consequence that his father's money could not dissolve. He was the younger of Wallace Rourke's two sons, darker than his brother Wyatt, with a handsome face that sat atop a fundamental rottenness, the way expensive paint sits atop rotting wood. He drove a lifted black pickup truck with custom wheels and an exhaust system tuned to announce his presence from 3 blocks away. He ran a small methamphetamine operation on the south side of town, not because he needed the money, but because the risk of it appealed to him the way risk always appeals to people who have never faced a risk they could not buy their way out of. Wallace Rourke knew about the operation and had chosen to regard it as a phase, the kind of thing that sons of powerful men sometimes did and then grew out of. Reese noticed Trent's truck idling on the opposite side of Route 9 on a Tuesday evening in early November. She noticed it because the truck had been there the previous Tuesday as well, and the Tuesday before that, and each time it had been there during the hours when Chloe was inside the diner. She stood behind the counter and looked through the grease film window at the dark shape of the vehicle parked across the highway with its engine running. And she felt the cold settle into the base of her stomach in a way that had nothing to do with the November air coming through the gaps around the door frame. She had seen the way Trent watched Chloe in the school parking lot. His attention was not attraction in any recognizable sense, but rather the focused calculation of a person who has decided they want something and is working out the logistics of acquisition. Chloe's untouchable status was not to Trent Rourke a warning. It was a challenge. He was a rich boy who had spent his entire life being told that some things were off limits and had never once found that limitation to actually hold. The name Crow Miller meant danger to reasonable people. To Trent Rourke, it represented an obstacle which in his experience was simply a variant of the things his father's money was designed to remove. Reese wanted to tell Chloe. She turned the words over in her mind during her shifts, arranging and rearranging them, but every configuration felt inadequate. She had no proof, She had an instinct sharpened by years of reading rooms and reading people. An instinct is not something you can hand to another person in a way they can use. And beyond the inadequacy of the words, there was the practical impossibility of the action. She was Reese Mitchell from Decker Street, a girl who worked 30 hours a week for wages she brought home in an envelope. She did not have standing to walk up to the daughter of the Hells Angels sergeant-at-arms and say that a rich boy was watching her from across the road. She did not have standing to walk up to Crow Miller himself, which was the only action that might have actually mattered, because a girl like Reese did not approach men like Crow on the strength of a feeling. So she watched. She cataloged. She noted that the truck appeared more frequently in the second week of November. She noted that Trent had begun arriving at the diner for lunch on weekdays, sitting at the counter ordering coffee he did not drink, and watching the room with the proprietorial ease of someone who considered every space his by default. She noted that his older brother Wyatt had begun accompanying him, a broader and quieter version of the same fundamental type, with the same expensive boots and the same assumption of impunity. She noted all of this and said nothing because saying something required a certainty she could not produce, and because she kept waiting for the situation to resolve itself, the way situations sometimes do. The threat receding, the predator redirecting the danger, dispersing, without anyone having to put themselves between it and the thing it was moving toward. She was still waiting when the party at the reservoir was announced. It was the kind of party that Oak Haven High School students threw every fall out at the old water treatment reservoir 6 miles east of town on a dirt access road that the county had stopped maintaining years ago. The site had become traditional by default, isolated, unlit, surrounded by dense stands of pine, on 3 sides, the fourth side opening onto the rocky shoreline of the reservoir itself. Parents knew about these parties in the abstract and chose not to know about them in the specific, which was a tacit agreement that had held for at least 2 generations. No adults came, no police came. The access road was too rough for most vehicles, and the distance from town was enough of a deterrent. It was in the vocabulary of teenage social geography neutral ground. Reese heard about it at the diner on the Thursday before. She heard about it from a booth of sophomore boys who were talking too loudly about things they had not yet learned to discuss quietly. She heard Trent Rourke's name mentioned in connection with the party. She heard the inflection that boys used when they were discussing something that held a charge of anticipated cruelty, the flat excitement of people who expected to watch something happen and found the anticipation pleasurable. She heard Chloe's name mentioned after that, and the cold in the base of her stomach sharpened into something pointed and specific. She found Chloe at her locker the following morning. She did not have a plan. She had a conviction and an urgency that overrode her usual caution. "Are you going to the reservoir party Friday?" Reese asked. Chloe looked at her sideways. "My father doesn't know about it," she said, which wasn't an answer. Reese held her gaze. Chloe looked away first, which was unusual. There was something in Chloe's expression that Reese recognized, the look of a person who has been confined too long and is considering against their better judgment the open window. "I just want one night," Chloe said very quietly to no one in particular. Reese went home that night and sat at the kitchen table with her homework open in front of her and did not do any of it. She sat and thought about probability and about the weight of knowing something is coming and being unable to name it precisely enough to stop it. She thought about Trent Rourke's truck idling across the highway on Tuesday nights. She thought about the look on his face in the school parking lot. She thought about Chloe saying, "I just want one night," in the voice of someone who had not had enough of them. She was at the reservoir by 9:30 on Friday. She had told Sarah she was covering a late shift, which Sarah accepted without question, because late shifts were a regular feature of Reese's schedule, and because Sarah trusted her daughter with the trust of a woman who has watched her child be reliable in the face of every difficulty and has consequently stopped worrying about the small uncertainties. Reese drove her second-hand Civic out the access road with the headlights cutting through the November dark. The temperature outside in the low 30s, the smell of wood smoke reaching her before the bonfire itself came into view through the trees. The party was large by Oak Haven standards, 80 or 90 people clustered around a fire built in a pit someone had dug out years ago, and used ever since the wood stacked high enough to throw heat and light in a 20-foot radius. Beyond that radius, the dark was complete. Reese parked at the edge of the clearing and sat in the car for a moment watching the shapes of people moving in the firelight, trying to locate Chloe, trying to locate Trent, calibrating the geography of what she might be walking into. She spotted Chloe first. She was standing at the edge of the tree line on the far side of the fire, holding a plastic cup she was not drinking from, wearing her denim jacket and looking out at the dark water of the reservoir with the expression of someone who has come to a place hoping to feel something and has not yet found it. She looked isolated in the middle of 80 people. She looked like herself, which in Oak Haven meant she looked untouchable. And the untouchability had followed her out here to the neutral ground the same way it followed her everywhere. Reese got out of the car. The cold hit her immediately, biting through her jacket and settling against her face and hands. She started moving toward Chloe through the crowd. She never made it. The sound arrived before the lights did, the heavy percussive rumble of a large displacement engine, pulling hard up the access road, followed almost immediately by the blinding sweep of high-beam headlights cutting across the clearing. The crowd turned as one. The lifted black truck came to a stop at the edge of the fire's light, and the doors opened and Trent Rourke stepped out, followed by Wyatt, followed by three other young men whose names Reese did not know, but whose posture she recognized, the loose-limbed, alcohol-loosened posture of people who have come to a place expecting to get what they want. They had been drinking for hours. It was visible in the way Trent moved, with that brand of intoxicated confidence that in certain men translates directly into entitlement. The internal volume turned up on every impulse, while the governor that might moderate those impulses had been progressively disabled over the course of the evening. He scanned the crowd once, twice, and then his gaze landed on Chloe at the tree line, and his attention narrowed in the way of a predator that has located the thing it came looking for. Reese was moving before she had made a conscious decision to move. She was threading through the crowd in Trent's direction, cutting across the angle of his path, her mind running the geometry of interception, while the rest of the party stood and watched with the frozen collective paralysis of people who understand that something is happening that none of them intend to involve themselves in. Trent reached Chloe first. He stepped directly into her space with the aggression of someone who has decided that personal boundaries are a convention that applies to other people. Well, he said, his voice carrying easily over the crackle of the fire. Look who finally decided to come out. His words were slightly slurred, rounded at the edges by whiskey, sharpened at the center by intention. Back off, Trent. Chloe's voice was flat and controlled. She took a step back. He took a step forward. She turned to move away, and Wyatt was already there, stepping out of the dark beside the tree line, blocking her exit with the practiced ease of someone who has run this kind of maneuver before. Don't be like that. Trent reached out and closed his hand around her wrist with a suddenness and force that made her gasp, not a gentle grip, but a restraining one. The grip of someone communicating that they have made a decision about your movement. Your daddy's not here tonight, sweetheart. It's just us out here. His eyes moved over her face with an expression that made the cold in the pit of Reese's stomach become something close to rage. Why don't you come for a ride? Let go of me. Chloe's voice stayed level, but her shoulder had gone rigid with the effort of controlling what her body wanted to do, which was to pull away. Are you out of your mind? Do you understand who my father is? What he will do? Trent laughed. The laugh was the ugliest sound Reese had ever heard in a place with a fire and music, and 80 people pretending not to see what was happening in front of them. Your old man is a washed-up thug on a motorcycle, he said. My family runs this valley. He runs errands for us, even if nobody's told him that yet. He pulled her toward the truck. Reese hit him from the side. She had been covering the last 15 feet of ground at something approaching a run, and she led with her shoulder, driving it into Trent's chest with every pound of her weight behind it. The impact was sufficient. His grip on Chloe broke as he staggered backward, losing his footing in the loose dirt, going down hard on one knee. The plastic cup in his other hand hit the ground and scattered. He looked up at Reese with pure, uncomprehending shock. The specific shock of a person who has never in their life had someone they considered below them put their hands on them. Leave her alone. Reese's voice came out steadier than she felt. She was aware of her own heartbeat and of the absolute silence that had fallen over the clearing. Every person at the party now turned toward this section of the firelight. She was aware that she was standing between Trent Rourke and Chloe Miller, with nothing behind her position except the decision to take it. Trent got to his feet. The shock on his face had already completed its transformation into something considerably more dangerous. He wiped the dirt from the knee of his jeans and looked at Reese with the careful attention of a man recategorizing what he is looking at. "Mitchell," he said. His voice had gone quiet in a way that was worse than shouting. "You pathetic little diner rat." He turned to Wyatt. "Did she just—" Wyatt's fist connected with the side of Reese's face before Trent finished the sentence. The world went white and then went sideways. She hit the frozen ground with her hip and her shoulder, the impact driving the breath out of her, the cold of the asphalt against her cheek registering with strange clarity through the ringing in her skull. She tasted copper immediately, the flat penny taste of a split lip. She lay for half a second in the dirt with the bonfire wheeling at the edge of her vision, and the sound of Chloe screaming her name arriving through a layer of static. Trent stepped over her. He kicked her in the ribs, a short, brutal impact that compressed her chest and sent a bolt of pain through her side, sharp enough to make her vision fragment. She curled instinctively, her fingers closing around the frozen earth, and they found instead the rough cylinder of a piece of firewood that had rolled away from the edge of the pit. Her fingers wrapped around it without forethought. Trent reached down to grab her by the collar. She swung. The wood connected with the side of his skull above the ear, with a sound she would carry in her memory for a long time afterward, not the solid crack of movies, but something duller and more organic, the sound of force meeting resistance and winning. Trent's head snapped to the side. He made a sound that was not a word and went down under the dirt, and when he hit the ground, the firelight caught the dark line running down the side of his face, and it was red. The temperature of the clearing changed. It changed the way temperature changes when a storm front arrives, a perceptible shift in the air, a sudden acceleration of pressure from some invisible source. Wyatt's face, which had been wearing the detached amusement of a spectator, converted in a single moment into something entirely different. He looked at his brother on the ground. He looked at the blood on Trent's face. He looked at Reese still on the ground with the piece of firewood in her hand. Then he reached into his coat. The sound of the switchblade engaging was small and precise and carried perfectly through the cold November air. 6 inches of steel caught the firelight and held it. The crowd of teenagers had been watching in petrified silence, and now the silence deepened into something absolute. The held breath of a group of people who understand that they have watched a situation cross a threshold and are now waiting to see which way the weight falls. Wyatt Rourke was not looking at Reese when the blade came out. His eyes had moved past her to Chloe, and what was in his expression was not calculation, but fury. The fury of a person who blames a particular individual for a consequence they brought upon themselves. "You," he said, and the word carried everything that was wrong about him. He moved toward Chloe. Reese saw it happen in the way that certain moments present themselves with a terrible, slowed clarity. Each component visible and discrete: the arc of Wyatt's arm, the direction of his body, the specific destination of the blade. She saw Chloe take a step back and find the tree line directly behind her. She saw the distance close. She saw the geometry of what was about to occur, and she understood it completely, and she was already off the ground before the understanding had finished forming. Her legs driving her upright through the pain in her ribs, her body crossing the distance between them. She put herself between Wyatt Rourke and Chloe Miller. The impact was nothing like she had imagined. There was no pain in the first instant, only a sensation of cold pressure below her right ribs, followed immediately by Wyatt's face very close to hers. The bourbon on his breath, the shock in his eyes as his hand registered what it had done. The world narrowed to that proximity and that cold spreading sensation, and the sound of Chloe's voice arriving from somewhere that felt suddenly very far away. Wyatt pulled his hand back. He looked at what was in it. The blade was dark. Reese looked down at her jacket and watched the stain bloom outward from a point just below her right rib cage, with the slow inevitability of ink dropped in water. Wyatt, let's go. Trent's voice came from the ground high and cracked. Right now. Go. They ran. She heard the truck doors and the engine and the tires spinning in the dirt and the sound of the exhaust fading rapidly down the access road. Around her, the party disintegrated in real time, people moving away from the fire and into the dark, running for their own cars, fading into the tree line. The collective instinct of witnesses choosing not to be witnesses, asserting itself with absolute thoroughness. The bonfire continued to burn indifferent. Reese was on her knees. She did not remember going to her knees. Chloe was there directly in front of her, her face the color of ash, both hands pressing against Reese's stomach, through the jacket with a desperate force that registered distantly as pressure and then as pain, sharp and escalating. No, 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 Chloe was saying very quietly, the repetition of a person refusing a fact. Reese, look at me. Stay with me. Look at my face. Reese looked at her face. Are you hurt? She said. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, thinned out like a radio signal losing its station. Did he get you anywhere? No, Chloe said, and her voice broke on the word. Because of you. Because of you, Reese. Red and blue lights swept through the pine trees from the direction of the access road. Chloe's head came up immediately. She raised one blood-slicked hand and waved it in the direction of the lights, her voice cutting through the cold air. Help! We need help! Over here! The cruiser slowed. The lights continued to strobe through the trees. Reese watched the vehicle through the screen of her narrowing vision and saw it reduce speed and then impossibly, undeniably saw it accelerate again. The red and blue swept through the pines one more time as the cruiser turned and the lights moved away down the access road, diminishing, and then were gone. The silence after was total. Chloe stared at the place where the police car had been. Reese watched her process it, the moment of incomprehension, the moment of comprehension, the moment in which comprehension converted to a cold and absolute clarity that reshaped her understanding of what was going to happen and what was not going to happen on this frozen road tonight. Chloe's hands did not leave the wound. Her right hand kept the pressure steady and relentless, while her left hand found her phone in her jacket pocket. Her fingers were shaking and her hands were dark with blood, but she found the number and pressed it and raised the phone to her ear without a moment of hesitation. Dad, she said when the call connected. Her voice was level in the way that voices go level when the person speaking them has moved beyond fear into something that functions instead of collapsing. Dad, listen to me. She told him in 7 sentences exactly what had happened. She told him where they were. She told him what she had seen the cruiser do. Her voice did not shake. Her hands did not leave the wound. On the other end of the line, there was a silence that lasted 5 seconds. It was not the silence of a man processing information. It was the silence of a man who has received information and has already begun to act on it and is now simply inhabiting the interval between decision and consequence. Keep pressure on the wound, baby girl. Crow's voice was absolutely calm. The calm of a man who has operated in extreme circumstances many times and whose body has learned to organize itself most efficiently when the stakes are highest. Daddy's coming. Reese lay back against the frozen ground. The stars above the valley were very sharp and very cold and very numerous. Chloe's hands were still against her stomach, warm and insistent. The bonfire had burned down slightly in the time since everyone had run, but it still threw enough light to cast long shadows across the access road and to make the dark blood on the asphalt look black rather than red. She thought about Sarah at home in the yellow house on Decker Street. She thought about the wool socks in her locker at the diner. She thought about Tuesday evenings and cherry pie and the way Chloe held a coffee cup in both hands when the temperature dropped. She thought about how she had spent 17 years learning to be invisible and how the one moment she had chosen not to be had brought her here to this road, to this specific arrangement of cold air and firelight in Chloe Miller's hands, keeping her alive through the sheer force of refusal. She didn't regret it. She heard the motorcycle before she saw the headlight. She heard it the way you hear thunder first, as a vibration in the ground beneath her, transmitted up through the frozen earth and into her spine, and then as sound, the unmistakable sound of a large displacement engine being pushed very hard down a very straight road. The headlight appeared at the bend in the access road and accelerated toward them without any apparent reduction in speed. Clayton Crow Miller did not use the brakes. The Harley came into the clearing in a controlled slide, the rear wheel breaking loose and tracking sideways across the gravel. The bike going horizontal before it stopped, and Crow was off it before it had fully come to rest, vaulting over the frame and crossing the ground to where they were, in 4 strides, dropping to his knees in the dirt. He was a large man, larger in person than his reputation somehow, which was not something you expected from a reputation of that size. His arms were covered to the wrist in the layered ink of decades, and his face in the firelight was the face of a man who has chosen long ago to feel things deeply and to let none of those things show. He looked at his daughter first, a single sweeping assessment, eyes moving from her face to her hands to her body, confirming what she had told him on the phone. Then his eyes moved to Reese. He put his hands over Chloe's without a word, his large callous palms replacing hers with a steadiness that was not gentleness, but was something more useful than gentleness in that specific moment. He pressed down. Reese made an involuntary sound at the pressure, and he looked at her face. "Stay awake," he said. His voice was a low rumble aimed directly at her, the voice of a man accustomed to being obeyed by people in very difficult situations. "Look at me right now. Keep your eyes open." Reese looked at him. She concentrated on keeping her eyes open and fixed on his face, which was easier than she would have expected. There was something in his expression beneath the controlled surface of it that functioned like an anchor. Something that said, "I am here and I am not leaving, and you are going to be all right if you stay with me." Who did this? His eyes were still on Reese, but the question was directed at Chloe. "Wyatt Rourke," Chloe said. Her voice was steady and clear. "Trent grabbed me." Reese fought them off. "Wyatt pulled a knife and Dad, she jumped in front of it. He was going to stab me and she jumped in front of it." Crow was silent for 3 seconds. The silence had a weight to it that Reese would think about later when she had the distance to analyze it, a temperature dropping very rapidly in a very still room. It was not the silence of anger. It was the silence of something colder and more permanent than anger, being established in a man who had already decided what would happen next and was simply confirming the information that would determine the scope of it. He did not scream. He did not curse. He looked at his daughter's face, and then he looked at Reese Mitchell's face, and then he looked down at his own hands, keeping the girl alive on the frozen road, and something moved through his expression that was not visible enough to name but was large enough to feel. He reached into his cut with one hand and pulled out a phone and made a call with the brevity of a man whose communication with his people has been reduced through years of practice to its absolute essentials. "Jimmy," he said when it connected. "Van, Route 9 Reservoir Access. Now." He put the phone away. He looked at Chloe and then at Reese. "You're going to be all right," he said. He said it in the tone of a man stating a fact rather than offering a comfort. And in that moment, with the cold coming up through the ground and the fire burning down and the sound of a van engine starting somewhere in the distance, Reese believed him. The van arrived in 11 minutes. Jimmy Corcoran, called Rat by everyone who knew him, a nickname earned through 2 decades of navigating tight spaces and difficult situations, with a wiry efficiency, threw the Econoline into park at the edge of the clearing and had the side doors open before the engine fully died. He was a lean man in his late 30s with quick eyes and the economical movements of someone who had learned long ago that hesitation was a form of expenditure he could not afford. He took one look at the scene, Crow kneeling in the dirt, the blood Chloe's face, and did not ask any questions. He cleared the back of the van with 3 sweeping motions of his arms, pushing aside a coil of rope and 2 canvas duffel bags and a motorcycle jack. And then he stood back. Crow lifted Reese off the ground. He did it the way he did everything in that particular hour, without theatrics, without apparent effort, with a focused efficiency that had nothing to do with tenderness and everything to do with urgency. He slid his arms beneath her shoulders and her knees and stood in a single motion. And Reese felt the ground leave her and felt the searing pull of the wound protest the movement and heard herself make a sound she did not intend to make. Crow didn't slow down. He crossed to the van and laid her in the back on a moving blanket that Rat had spread across the floor, and Chloe climbed in beside her immediately, both hands going back to the wound before Reese had even registered the transition from cold asphalt to slightly less cold van floor. Keep the pressure on, Chloe, Crow said. No matter what she does, no matter what sound she makes. You don't let up. I know, Chloe said. She said it in the voice of someone who had been told important things by this man her entire life and had learned to carry them correctly. Crow shut the side doors. Reese heard him get into the passenger seat. Rat was already behind the wheel and the van was moving before the door was fully closed, pulling a tight arc through the clearing and bouncing hard down the access road at a speed that the road's condition did not support, but that the circumstances clearly demanded. Every impact of the van's suspension against the ruts and rocks of the unpaved road sent a fresh current of pain through Reese's side, and she concentrated on Chloe's face above her, and on the pressure of Chloe's hands, and on keeping her breathing even and shallow, which was the only configuration of breathing that did not make the pain spike into something unmanageable. You're doing really well, Chloe said. She was looking directly at Reese, her dark eyes steady and close. Just keep looking at me. Don't look at anything else. I'm cold, Reese said. It came out with more candor than she intended, but it was the most accurate description of her current physical experience. The cold had moved from being an external condition to being something internal. A coldness originating from somewhere in her center and radiating outward. I know. Chloe adjusted her position, moving closer, using her own body against Reese's side, in the way of someone who has understood that warmth is a resource she has in surplus right now, and Reese does not. I know you're cold. Just stay with me. The lights of Oak Haven appeared through the van's front windshield as they came down out of the eastern hills and onto Route 9. Reese could see them from her position on the floor, the pale orange wash of streetlights, the occasional lit window of a house going past the familiar geography of the town, reconstituted into something strange and vertiginous from this angle and at this hour. She had driven this stretch of road 10,000 times. She had never seen it from the floor of a moving van while bleeding, and the dissonance of the familiar and the catastrophic had a quality she could not have described to anyone who had not experienced it. From the front seat, Crow was on the phone. He had been on the phone almost continuously since they left the reservoir, conducting a series of brief, dense conversations in the clipped vocabulary of a man communicating with people who do not require explanation. Reese could not follow all of it. She caught fragments, a name, a location, a question answered in the negative, and she understood from the cadence of it, even through the compression of her own diminishing focus, that something was being set in motion that was considerably larger than the van she was lying in. Oak Haven General Hospital was 6 minutes from the Route 9 turnoff. Rat covered the distance in 4. The emergency department entrance was a pair of automatic glass doors set into a low concrete overhang, lit by fluorescent panels that cast everything beneath them in a flat clinical white. Rat brought the van into the ambulance bay with its tires chirping against the painted concrete, and Crow had the passenger door open while they were still moving. By the time the van stopped, he was already at the side doors, pulling them open, reaching in for Reese with the same controlled urgency he had demonstrated at the reservoir. He carried her through the automatic doors. The fluorescent light hit Reese like a physical thing after the dark of the van, and she was aware of the smell of the place, antiseptic and recycled air, and something underneath both of those things, something organic and unpleasant that hospitals work to suppress and never fully manage. She was aware of the sound of her own blood on the linoleum floor as Crow moved through the waiting area, the sound reaching her as a series of soft impacts before she understood what she was hearing. Crow's voice, when he spoke, carried to every corner of the emergency department. I need a trauma team. He did not shout. He did not need to shout. His voice had the authority of a sound that preempts all other sounds, a voice that a room full of people hears not merely with their ears, but with their nervous systems. Right now. Trauma. Move. The night shift charge nurse behind the admissions desk reached for a phone. 2 orderlies who had been moving a cart near the far wall stopped and looked at each other. The waiting room. 3 people at that hour, a man with his arm in a makeshift sling, a woman holding a sleeping child, an elderly man studying the floor became collectively still. The attending physician came out of a side room. His name was Dr. Peter Hargrove, and he was 51 years old, and he had been a competent emergency physician for 23 years. And he had received 40 minutes earlier a phone call from Sheriff Dale Harmon that had asked him to do something he had never been asked to do in 23 years of medicine. He had been sitting in the side room since that call, in the agony of a man who has been offered a bribe large enough to reconfigure what he thought he knew about himself, and he had not yet arrived at a conclusion. He came out of the room and he saw the blood, and he saw the girl, and he saw the man carrying her, and he took a step forward, and then he stopped. "Sir," he said, his voice was not steady. "We have protocols for situations involving his eyes moved to the winged death's head on the back of Crow's leather cut, for situations with possible gang affiliation. The police need to be notified before we could." Crow covered the distance between them in 3 steps. What happened next happened very quickly and very quietly. Crow's free hand closed on the front of Hargrove's scrubs, and Hargrove's back met the wall beside the side room door, with a sound that was not loud enough to be heard at the admissions desk, but was heard by Hargrove with absolute total clarity. Crow brought his face to within 8 inches of the physician's. "Listen to me," Crow said. His voice had dropped to something barely above a whisper, which made it considerably more effective than shouting would have been. "That girl took a knife that was meant for my daughter. She is not in a gang. She is 17 years old, and she works at a diner on Route 9, and she has a mother at home who doesn't know where she is tonight." He paused. And in the pause, Hargrove looked into his eyes and found in them the resolution of a man who has decided what he will and will not tolerate, and has arrived at that decision through a process that does not leave room for revision. "If you let her die in this building because someone with money made a phone call, I will not simply find you. I will burn this hospital to the ground with you inside it. And I will make sure that everyone you have ever cared about knows why it happened." Crow released the front of his scrubs. "Do your job, Doc, right now." Hargrove stood against the wall for exactly 2 seconds. He looked at Reese Mitchell laid out on the gurney that had appeared from somewhere behind the admissions desk, her face the color of old chalk, the dark stain on her jacket spreading with the relentlessness of something that does not hurry because it does not need to. He looked at the expression on Crow Miller's face and made a calculation that 23 years of medicine had not prepared him for, but that 2 seconds of raw honesty made very simple. "Get the trauma surgeon on call," he said to the charge nurse. His voice had steadied completely. He was already moving toward the gurney. "Call the OR and tell them we need a room in 15 minutes. Somebody get me a CBC and a type and cross and get 2 large-bore IVs in her right now. Move." The emergency department transformed in the way that emergency departments transform when the people inside them decide to actually function, a rapid reorganization of personnel and purpose orderlies, appearing a crash cart moving into position, the charge nurse on 2 phones simultaneously. Reese felt the gurney moving beneath her and the ceiling tiles beginning to scroll past overhead, and Chloe's hands finally releasing her as the medical team closed in. And she turned her head to find Chloe standing at the edge of the controlled chaos, with her blood-covered hands at her sides, her face holding the expression of a person who has done everything within their power and is now required to stop and wait. "Reese," Chloe said. "Just her name. Nothing else." The gurney went through the swinging doors and the doors closed behind it. Crow stood in the hallway outside the OR for 40 seconds after the doors stopped moving. He stood with his hands at his sides and his eyes on the doors, and his face holding nothing that anyone in the corridor could read. Then he turned and walked back through the emergency department to the ambulance bay, where Rat was standing beside the van with a cigarette he was not lighting. He pulled out his phone, not the same phone he had been using in the van, a different one, heavier, older, encrypted. He scrolled to a number that did not have a name attached to it. He called it. "It's Crow," he said when the line connected. The voice on the other end was gritty and unhurried, the voice of a man who does not receive calls at this hour from this number unless something significant has occurred, and who has long since made his peace with the fact that significant things occur. The Rourkes put a blade in a civilian kid, Crow continued. She was protecting Chloe. She's in surgery right now. The local badge was on the road when it happened. He drove away. His voice carried no inflection. It stated facts the way a document states facts. The kid might not make it through the night. A pause on the other end. Brief. Then we ride at midnight. Lock the town down. Crow ended the call. He looked at Rat. Go get Sarah Mitchell, he said. Decker Street, 2 blocks south of the tracks. Pale yellow house. He paused. Be gentle with her. She's sick. Rat nodded and got into the van. Inside the hospital, Wallace Rourke had already been on the phone with Sheriff Dale Harmon for 8 minutes. The conversation had started as a panicked relay of information. Trent's injury, Wyatt's involvement, the knife, the girl on the access road, and had consolidated over the course of those 8 minutes into a strategy. Sheriff Harmon had dispatched Deputy Carl Pruitt to verify that the scene at the reservoir had been cleared of any useful evidence before anyone else arrived. He had called Oak Haven General and reached Dr. Hargrove. The strategy was simple in the way that strategies built entirely on corruption can be simple. Classify the injury as gang-related violence. Invoke the protocol that required police clearance before treatment could proceed. Introduce delays sufficient to move the situation from critical to irreversible. A girl without connections, a family without resources, a hospital that had learned over years of careful financial relationship with the Rourke family that certain calls from certain numbers represented instructions rather than suggestions. The strategy had encountered Clayton Miller. In his study on the north side of Oak Haven, behind the iron gates of the property on Ridgeline Drive, Wallace Rourke sat in the chair behind his mahogany desk and tried to reach people who were not answering his calls. His state senator had stopped picking up at 11:30. His attorney had offered a response so hedged and qualified as to be functionally useless. The private security contractor he kept on retainer was asking questions about the specific nature of the situation that Wallace did not want to answer on a recorded line. He sat in the chair and looked at his hands and tried to calculate the distance between where he was and where he needed to be, and the calculation kept producing numbers that frightened him. In the adjoining room, his sons were worse. Trent had been treated by the family's private physician for the laceration on his skull, 5 stitches, a mild concussion, nothing that wouldn't heal, and was now sitting on the leather sofa with a bag of ice held to the side of his head and an expression of stunned injury that Wallace found both pitiable and infuriating. Wyatt was pacing. He had been pacing for 2 hours. His hands kept moving to his jacket pockets and then back out again. And he kept looking at the windows as though expecting to see something at the glass. She came out of nowhere, Wyatt said for the 3rd time. I wasn't trying to. The knife was for the Mitchell girl, not for... You drew a knife on Crow Miller's daughter, Wallace said. He said it quietly and precisely, which was more devastating than any volume could have been. You drew a knife on her at a party with 80 witnesses present, and you stabbed the girl who was protecting her. His voice was entirely flat. I have spent 30 years building something in this valley, and you have put it at risk in 30 seconds. We can fix it, Trent said from the sofa. His voice had the confidence of someone who has been fixed before and expects to be fixed again. You always fix it, Dad. Wallace looked at his younger son. He thought about what Crow Miller's voice would sound like on the phone, which he had not yet received, but which he understood with the instinct of a man who has spent his life reading situations was coming. He thought about the nature of the risk that Crow Miller represented, which was not the risk of violence in the immediate sense, though that was certainly present, but the risk of a response calibrated and organized in ways that money could not easily predict or preempt. He picked up the phone and called Sheriff Harmon again. The biker clubhouse on the eastern edge of town received 7 visitors between midnight and 2 in the morning, each arriving separately, and each leaving within minutes, their departures directed toward points outside Oak Haven. Phone calls moved along encrypted lines to addresses in Oakland, in Vallejo, and San Jose, and the desert chapters brief and specific calls that contained coordinates and times, and the kind of language that required no elaboration to the people receiving it. Men who had been asleep woke up. Men who had been in bars paid their tabs. Men who had been working night shifts arranged coverage. The organization moved the way organizations move when they have been doing a specific thing for a very long time, with a fluency that made the individual components nearly invisible and the collective results seem almost inevitable. Sarah Mitchell arrived at Oak Haven General at 4:17 in the morning, escorted by Rat Corcoran and a large, quiet man named Briggs, who said nothing during the entire drive and held the hospital door open with the careful courtesy of a man making a deliberate effort. Sarah was wearing the coat she kept by the front door and the expression of a woman who has received terrible news and is in the process of deciding not to fall apart, which is the only decision available to her. She was 53 years old and her illness had made her seem older in her body while leaving her face with a clarity and directness that her daughter had inherited. She walked into the hospital on her own legs, and she found Crow Miller in the hallway outside the surgical waiting area. He saw her coming and he moved toward her. He removed his sunglasses. The gesture was small and carried a great deal of weight, and Sarah registered it the way people register meaningful gestures when they are too frightened to respond to them in the conventional way, as information to be held and processed later. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said. His voice, when it was not being deployed as an instrument of authority or threat, had a resonance that was not what people expected from a face like his. "My name is Clayton Miller." He paused. He held her gaze with his, and what was in his eyes was not comfortable to look at. Directly, there was too much in there, too much that had been seen and done and decided, but there was also unmistakably something that functioned like grief. "Your daughter is in surgery right now. She's been in surgery for 4 hours. The doctors tell me she's strong." He paused again. "What I need to tell you, ma'am, is what she did tonight, and why I'm here." Sarah listened. She stood in the fluorescent light of the hallway with her coat still buttoned and her hands folded in front of her, and she listened to the man tell her what her daughter had done, and her face did not change its expression throughout, which was not because she felt nothing, but because she was saving what she felt for later, for a private place where she could afford to feel it properly. "Your girl has the heart of a lion," Crow said. He said it simply without ornament. "She saved my world tonight." He let the weight of that sit for a moment in the hallway between them. "As long as she draws breath, this club owes her a debt that doesn't have a ceiling. Nobody in this hospital touches her. Nobody in this town touches her or you. You have my word as a man." Sarah looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded once with the same quiet dignity that Reese had, and she went to find a chair outside the surgical unit to wait in. Dawn arrived in Oak Haven the way it usually did in November gray and gradual, the light coming in low over the eastern ridge and spreading across the valley floor without enthusiasm. The early risers on the south side of town noticed it first because they were already awake, already moving through the early morning routines of people whose days begin before the town has decided to. The retired mechanic on Cottonwood Lane heard it before he saw it and stood on his porch in his work jacket, listening to what he initially thought was a prolonged mechanical event of some kind, an earthquake or a sustained explosion, or something industrial failing catastrophically somewhere nearby. He stood there for several seconds before he understood that it was not failing. It was arriving. 200 Harley-Davidsons entered the Oak Haven Valley from 3 directions simultaneously in staggered formation, riding with a precision that was not accidental. They came down Route 9 from the north, in the East Side Highway, from the desert, in the back road over Ritter Pass from the south, and they converged on the town center with the coordinated inevitability of a military operation that has been rehearsed, because in every meaningful sense it had been. They wore leather cuts with the winged death's head displayed on their backs, chapter patches from across the California system, Oakland, Vallejo, San Jose, Fresno, the nomad charters that claimed no fixed territory but answered certain calls regardless of geography. These were not men who had assembled in anger or in disorder. They were men who had assembled in response to a specific situation and who understood precisely what they had come to do. By 6 in the morning, Oak Haven General Hospital was surrounded. The bikers parked in tight, precise rows that blocked all 3 vehicle entrances to the hospital's parking areas. They established positions at the emergency department doors, at the loading dock on the hospital's east side, and at the helicopter landing pad on the roof access. Dutch Holloway, A man the size of a refrigerator, with a face that suggested he had survived things that would have killed anyone else and intended to survive. Several more took the primary position at the emergency room entrance with four others beside him. Ghost Harrison, who had earned his name through a combination of silence and the soundless quality of appearing somewhere without anyone having observed his arrival, positioned himself at the end of the hallway outside the surgical unit on the third floor, where Reese Mitchell was still in recovery. The hospital's internal operations continued. Patients were not impeded. Staff was not threatened. The bikers said nothing to the people moving in and out of the facility beyond the occasional wordless communication of bodies positioned in space with clear intent. But no one with business that was not directly related to the medical care of the people inside that building passed through those entrances, without understanding that they were doing so at the explicit tolerance of the men in leather, and that this tolerance was not unconditional. Inside in the recovery area adjacent to the surgical unit, Reese Mitchell was alive. The surgery had taken 4 hours and 20 minutes. The knife had nicked the right branch of her hepatic artery and punctured the ascending colon. The trauma surgeon, a compact and precise woman named Dr. Adler, who had been called in from home at midnight and had operated with the focused economy of someone who has done a great deal of difficult work in the small hours, had repaired both injuries with the cautiousness of someone who understood that she was working on a 17-year-old body that would need to carry the repairs for a long time. The surgery had gone well, which in surgical terms meant that it had gone as planned, and Reese was in the recovery area on a morphine drip and a blood pressure monitor and an IV delivering fluids and antibiotics, and her vital signs, while not comfortable, were stable. She was not conscious, not for the first hours. Sarah sat beside the bed. She had been there since the surgical team told her that the operation was complete, and she sat in the plastic chair with her coat still on because the recovery room was cool and she was already cold from the inside, in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. She held her daughter's hand, the left one, which was not connected to anything with both of her own. And she sat and she was simply present in the way that mothers are present at the bedside of their children, which is a presence that has no adequate description and requires none. Chloe sat on the floor in the corner with her back against the wall. She had been given a set of scrubs to change into because her clothes were unwearable, and she had pulled an oversized club hoodie over the scrubs against the chill of the room. She was not sleeping. Her eyes were open and fixed on Reese's face with an attention so concentrated it seemed to have a physical quality, as though the force of her watching could serve as an additional guarantee. Outside the hospital, Sheriff Dale Harmon arrived at 7:40 with 3 cruisers and 4 deputies, and the expression of a man who has spent the night being told he needs to do something and has run out of reasons not to attempt it. Harmon was a man who had been purchased over the course of many years through increments small enough to seem reasonable. At the time of each transaction, a contribution to his re-election campaign, a renovation on his lake house paid for by a Rourke subsidiary, a series of calls he had made in situations he had managed that had seemed at each individual moment like reasonable accommodations. He had not woken up one morning and decided to be corrupt. He had arrived there gradually through the compounding of small decisions and had made his peace with it because the alternative was a kind of reckoning he was not prepared for. He was not prepared for this either, but the calls from Wallace Rourke had left him without the option of inaction. The 3 cruisers pulled up to the main entrance of the hospital and their lights came on, and Harmon got out of the lead vehicle with his hand on his service weapon in the way of a man who wants the option visible without committing to anything specific. He was flanked by his 4 deputies, none of whom appeared to want to be there. In front of them, across 20 feet of hospital parking lot asphalt, 50 Hells Angels stood in a formation that was not a line in the informal sense, but something considerably more deliberate. The formation opened slowly, and Clayton Crow Miller walked through it. He was wearing a clean black t-shirt under his cut and his sunglasses were on despite the gray morning light. He stopped 8 feet from Harmon. "This is an unlawful assembly," Harmon said. He had found something approaching his official voice, though it required effort to maintain. "You are blockading a medical facility and obstructing access to emergency services. I am ordering you to disperse immediately. He paused. Anyone who does not comply will be subject to arrest. The men behind Crow did not move. Crow himself did not move. He looked at Harmon with the settled patience of someone who has rehearsed none of this because they don't need to rehearse it. You had a deputy on the Reservoir Access Road last night, Dale Crow said. His voice was conversational. It carried easily in the cold morning air without being raised. Carl Pruitt. He was on that road. He saw a 17-year-old girl bleeding out on the asphalt, and he drove away because Wallace Rourke told you to make sure there were no witnesses who could get to a hospital. He paused, letting that sit in the air between them. You tried to let a kid die to protect a couple of rich boys who put a knife in her. Harmon opened his mouth. Crow continued without any change in his cadence. Your laws don't apply in this parking lot right now. This hospital belongs to us until that girl walks out of it on her own feet. If any badge attempts to enter this building for any purpose other than a genuine medical emergency, we will treat that as an act of hostility, and we will respond accordingly. He looked at Harmon steadily. You have 22 sworn officers in this department. I have 200 people in this parking lot who have survived things that your officers have not been required to survive. You don't have the manpower for what comes next if you push this. Harmon looked at the men behind Crow. He looked at the faces. He looked at the chains and the steel-toed boots and the stillness of men who are not performing readiness, but simply inhabiting it. He looked at Crow's face and found nothing there that he could negotiate with or appeal to or redirect. He looked at the 4 deputies beside him and saw in each of their faces a version of the calculation he was running himself. And none of the calculations were producing outcomes that resembled anything good. He got back in the cruiser. He did not say anything further. He signaled his deputies and they got into their vehicles, and the 3 cruisers reversed out of the hospital parking lot and drove back toward the center of town and did not return. Inside the recovery room on the 3rd floor in the late morning of that gray November day, Reese Mitchell opened her eyes. The ceiling was white and textured, and the light above it was fluorescent, and there was a sound she identified after a moment as the rhythmic beeping of a cardiac monitor, regular and patient keeping time with something she could not immediately verify as her own heartbeat, but which turned out to be, when she directed her attention to it, exactly that. She was alive. The recognition came not with relief, but with a kind of flat objective acknowledgement, the way you acknowledge a mathematical fact. Yes, this is the condition, here are its properties. The pain arrived approximately 2 seconds after the recognition of consciousness. It came from her right side, deep and pulling, with a character that she had no prior reference for. Not sharp, not burning, but enormous, like something structural had been rearranged inside her. And her nervous system was still filing its report on what had been moved and where it had been relocated. She tried to shift her weight, and the pain spiked, and she stopped. Reese! Sarah's voice arrived before her face did. Then her face was there directly above, close enough that Reese could see the lines around her eyes and the specific redness of someone who has been crying without allowing themselves to fully cry. Baby, don't move. Please don't try to move, Mom, Reese said. Her voice was a version of itself, the same voice but thinner, like a signal running at reduced power. What time is it? It's almost noon, Sarah said. She tightened her grip on Reese's hand. You've been in surgery and then asleep. You've been asleep for hours. Reese processed this. She turned her head slowly and found Chloe rising from the floor in the corner, crossing the room in 4 quick steps to the side of the bed. She had been crying recently and was working to conceal the evidence of it, which Reese noted with the observational reflex that apparently survived morphine and blood loss and 4 hours of surgery. You stupid, brave idiot, Chloe said. Her voice was hoarse. She leaned down and rested her forehead against Reese's shoulder very carefully, making no contact with anything below the collarbone. Why did you do that? It wasn't a question. It was the kind of statement that comes after hours of asking a question and receiving no answer and deciding to keep asking anyway. Are you hurt? Reese said. Is anything broken? Did he touch you? No, Chloe said into her shoulder. Because of you. None of that happened because of you. Reese looked at the ceiling. Good, she said. Good. She became aware over the next few minutes of a sound she could not immediately place, a rhythmic, low mechanical vibration that seemed to come from somewhere outside the building, transmitted through the walls and the floor in a way that was more felt than heard. She looked at Sarah, who was watching her with the careful attention of someone monitoring for signs of deterioration. "What is that sound?" Reese said. Sarah glanced at Chloe. Chloe looked at Reese. "Outside," she said. "It's the motorcycles." She paused, and in the pause, Reese watched something move through her expression. Not pride exactly, but something in the same register. "They've been here since before dawn." Reese lay still and felt the vibration in the walls and in the floor beneath her, that low mechanical heartbeat surrounding the building from every direction. And she closed her eyes and held that information somewhere inside her chest, where the pain hadn't reached yet. Crow came into the room 20 minutes later. He filled the doorway in the way that large men fill narrow spaces, and he moved to the foot of the bed and stood there and looked at Reese Mitchell with an expression that she would remember for the rest of her life. Not because it was warm exactly, but because of what it contained. Something that had been decided irreversibly by the events of the previous night, and that would not be revisited or revised. "How's the pain?" he said. Reese looked at him. "It's there," she said. He nodded. He reached into his cut, and he held his hand over the bedside table, and he opened his fingers, and a heavy silver Zippo lighter fell softly onto the surface. It was custom-made, the case engraved with a winged death's head, the metalwork dense and precisely executed. The weight of it was visible even in the sound it made against the table. "In my world," Crow said, "loyalty and sacrifice are the only currencies that matter. Everything else depreciates." He looked at the lighter on the table and then at Reese. "You shed your blood to keep my daughter breathing. That makes you family, not a concept of family, not a gesture toward it. Family. From this day until the day they put you in the ground, you carry the protection of this club. Nobody in this state puts a hand on you. Nobody in this state puts a hand on your mother. The debt is absolute." Reese looked at the lighter. She looked at Crow. She thought about the question that had been forming in the back of her mind since she first became conscious, pushing through the morphine and the pain to make itself heard. "What about the Rourke?" she said. Crow's face did the thing it did when the father receded and the sergeant-at-arms came forward, the temperature dropping across his features until what remained was something that had nothing in it except purpose. "Don't think about the Rourkes," he said. "They are learning something tonight about the difference between owning a town and owning consequences." He turned and walked back to the door. He paused in the frame without turning around. "Rest," he said. "You earned it." The fog that rolled into the Oak Haven Valley after midnight was the kind that seemed to rise from the ground rather than descend from above, a gray groundwater seeping up through the valley floor and swallowing the streetlights and the landmarks one by one until the geography of the town became a matter of memory rather than visibility. The Rourke estate sat behind its iron gates on Ridgeline Drive, with its lights burning in every window, which in the fog gave the house the quality of something glowing from within, like an ember that hasn't gone out yet but will. Inside, Wallace Rourke had stopped making calls. The list of people he could call had been exhausted, and the responses he had received had been an aggregate. A picture of a man discovering that the network he had spent 30 years constructing had been built on the assumption of his continued invincibility, and that the assumption had a load-bearing quality that was now being tested in ways it had not been engineered for. His senator would not pick up. His attorney had advised him, in writing, not to contact him further until the legal situation clarified. His security contractor had sent him a message citing a conflict of interest without specifying what the conflict was. He sat behind his mahogany desk and he was very quiet. Wyatt had stopped pacing around 10 o'clock. He was sitting on the floor in the corner of the adjoining room with his back against the wall and his knees pulled to his chest, which was not a posture that any of the people who had known Wyatt Rourke as the older son of a powerful man, confident and entitled and physical, would have recognized. Trent was on the sofa as he had been for hours, staring at the ceiling with the ice bag long since abandoned and the whiskey glass empty beside him. Neither brother spoke to the other. There was nothing to say that would make the fog outside the windows any less dense, or the sound of motorcycle engines that had been circling the perimeter of the property all evening any less present. They are not going to do anything Wallace had told them at 9 o'clock. They are staging. It's psychological. They can't touch us here without federal consequences that they are not willing to risk. He had believed this when he said it. He was less certain of it now. The call to the extraction helicopter had been Wallace's contingency plan, the one he had been most careful to keep separate from everything else. A private charter through a company registered in Nevada that had no formal connection to the Rourke name, paid for through a financial instrument that would have required significant investigative effort to trace. The helicopter was scheduled to arrive at 1:30 in the morning on the back lawn, which was separated from the rest of the property by 100 feet of open manicured grass and backed directly against the pine forest on the slope behind the house. The plan was simple. The three of them would cross the lawn when they heard the rotors board and be in Nevada before morning. At 1:15, Wallace told his sons to get their bags. They moved through the darkened house without lights, Wallace leading Wyatt behind him. Trent last. They reached the glass doors overlooking the back lawn, and Wallace pressed his face briefly against the glass and looked out into the fog and saw nothing except gray opacity and the vague shapes of the manicured hedges at the edges of the lawn, which disappeared into the fog at about 15 feet. He could hear nothing. He checked his watch. 1:20. At 1:28, they heard the rotors. The sound came down from above, muffled by fog, but unmistakable, the rhythmic mechanical thrum of a helicopter descending, the sound thickening as the aircraft came below the ridgeline and into the valley. Wallace put his hand on the door handle. Trent said something under his breath. Wyatt exhaled. The landing lights came through the fog, first blinking green and red, descending in a steady, controlled pattern toward the center of the lawn. Wallace pushed the door open, and the cold fog hit them, and he said, "Now, go now," and took his first step onto the terrace. The spotlights came on. They came on simultaneously, 50 of them, military-grade, positioned along the entire perimeter of the tree line, on three sides of the lawn, their beams crossing and overlapping to create a field of light so complete and so sudden that after the dark of the house and the fog, it registered as physically painful. Wallace threw his arm across his face. Wyatt stumbled backward into the doorframe. The lawn was entirely illuminated, every blade of grass visible and at its edges. Stepping out of the tree line and into the light were the shapes of men. Many men arranged with the patience of people who have been waiting there for a long time. Dutch Holloway stood at the center of the tree line. He raised the flare gun to a 45-degree angle and fired. The red flare crossed the helicopter's descent path in a brilliant crimson arc, passing directly in front of the aircraft at a distance of perhaps 30 feet. The helicopter's nose pitched up immediately, the rotors changing pitch as the pilot pulled collective and cyclic simultaneously, the aircraft banking hard left and clawing for altitude with an urgency that communicated everything about how the pilot had decided to weigh his fee against his survival. The engine screamed. The running lights swung in a wide arc across the fog and then diminished, rising, and then were gone. "Come back," Wallace said. He was on the terrace with his hand outstretched toward the place where the lights had been, and the futility of the gesture was visible even to him, and yet he held it for a moment before he let his arm fall. "Come back." Crow walked through the front door of the Rourke estate 20 minutes later, admitted not by force, but by the quiet decision of one of Wallace's private security detail who had looked at the situation and made a different kind of calculation. He moved through the foyer to the living room with Dutch behind him and two other members of the club, and he set a leather-bound ledger on the glass coffee table with a sound that was quiet and definitive and that made Wallace Rourke close his eyes. Wallace opened them. He looked at the ledger. The color of his face had been going in one direction for the last several hours, and it continued in that direction, now arriving at something that had no warmth in it at all. "That's Trent's operation," Crow said. "The accounting for it. My brothers visited the laboratory on the south side an hour ago." He paused. "They burned it to the ground." He looked at Wyatt on the floor and Trent on the sofa and Wallace behind the desk. "But they kept the paperwork." He pulled his phone from his cut and placed it on the desk beside the ledger. "The FBI field office in Sacramento received a copy of that ledger 40 minutes ago. A very detailed copy, with a full accounting of the relationship between the narcotics operation and the Rourke real estate holdings. RICO implications throughout. Wallace put his hands over his face. Wyatt made a sound. Trent did not move. Crow picked up his phone and turned toward the door. Dutch and the others turned with him. At the door, Crow stopped. He didn't turn around. When you get to federal prison, Wyatt, he said, tell them you're the boy who pulled a knife on Crow Miller's daughter. He paused. You'll learn very quickly what my name means in there. The sirens were already audible. Not the familiar wail of the Oak Haven Sheriff's Department, but something deeper and more authoritative, multiple units from the direction of the highway. The Hells Angels moved through the Rourke estate and out through the back, through the trees rejoining the larger formation on the perimeter roads, and fading into the fog in the way of people who have done what they came to do and have no interest in taking credit for it. The federal vehicles breached the front gate 4 minutes later. They came through their iron gates with the unhurried authority of institutions that do not need to hurry, because the outcome has already been determined. Special Agent Donna Carver of the FBI's Sacramento field office stepped out of the lead SUV and stood for a moment in the fog-diffused light of the estate's exterior lamps, taking in the scope of the property with the practiced assessment of someone who has executed a great many warrants on a great many properties and has learned to read them as records of accumulated time and force and the particular kind of pressure that produces certain kinds of structures. The Rourke estate was a record of 30 years of very specific pressure, and it was about to be read very carefully. Wallace Rourke did not resist. There was nothing left in him that resembled resistance. He was sitting behind the mahogany desk when the agents came through the front door, and he raised his hands with the mechanical compliance of a man whose internal machinery has stopped. The tailored suit that had represented his authority and his distance from consequence for 3 decades looked in the harsh light of federal flashlights like a costume. He was walked out through his own front door in handcuffs and placed in the back of a federal vehicle, and the iron gates of the property closed behind the convoy. And that was the end of the Rourke dynasty in Oak Haven, California, though the legal proceedings that formalized that ending would take considerably longer. Wyatt came out of the house weeping. He had been weeping since Crow had laid the ledger on the coffee table, and he had understood what it contained, and the weeping had the quality of something that had found its level and would not be quickly exhausted. He was 21 years old, and he had spent his entire life in a house that had taught him that the rules governing other people did not apply to him, and the education was being revised very rapidly in ways that produced in the revision a grief that was partly for his freedom, and partly, though, he would not have recognized this for the person he might have been if he had been taught differently. He was placed in handcuffs and walked to a separate vehicle, and he looked back at the house, once searching for his father in the dark, and Wallace was already inside the federal vehicle with its doors closed. Trent walked out under his own power with an expression that had gone entirely blank, which was perhaps the most honest expression he had worn in years. Across town in a simultaneous operation coordinated from the field office in Sacramento, and that Sheriff Dale Harmon had not been informed of because he was himself a subject of it, federal agents arrived at the Oak Haven Sheriff's Department. Harmon was at his desk when they came through the door, and he had a shredder running, which was noted in the subsequent report as an indicator of consciousness of guilt, and he raised his hands when the agents identified themselves and did not reach for his sidearm, which was the first genuinely wise decision he had made in a considerable period of time. By dawn, the news had moved through Oak Haven the way that significant news moves through small towns, not through any single channel, but through all of them simultaneously, neighbor to neighbor and phone call to phone call, and the particular velocity of information in a community where everyone knows the relevant parties. The diner on Route 9 opened at 6, and by 6:30 it was packed in a way that had nothing to do with breakfast and everything to do with the collective need of a town to be in the same room as other people who understand what has just happened. Bud Castor stood behind the counter and poured coffee and said almost nothing, which was more eloquent than most of what he might have said. People spoke of the motorcycles. People spoke of the hospital. People spoke of the sound of the rotors, and then the red flare, and then the silence afterward. People who had been at the reservoir that night, who had scattered into the trees when the situation at the bonfire reached its crisis point, sat in the vinyl booths with their hands around their cups and did not speak of what they had done or not done, which was its own kind of accounting. The town had been saved. The understanding of how it had been saved, not by law, not by the institutions that were supposed to produce justice, but by 200 men in leather who had organized themselves around the blood of a 17-year-old girl, settled over Oak Haven with a complexity that would take years to fully process. There was gratitude in it, and there was shame in it, and there was a reckoning with the nature of power that a town accustomed to a particular distribution of it was not entirely prepared to conduct. In the ICU on the third floor of Oak Haven, General Reese Mitchell was conducting her own reckoning, which was smaller in scope and considerably more immediate. The days after surgery had a quality she had not anticipated, which was the quality of absolute physical helplessness imposed on a person who had never in her conscious life been helpless. She had been managing things, her mother's illness, the finances of the household, the 30-hour work week, the constant low-grade calculation of what could be afforded and what could not, since she was 15 years old. And the management had become so fundamental to her sense of herself that its absence, enforced by the combination of surgical staples and a morphine drip and the strict instructions of Dr. Adler, felt like a kind of amputation. She lay in the bed, and she was not managing anything. She was being managed, which was a reversal she found more disorienting than the physical pain, and the physical pain was not inconsiderable. Sarah came every day. She came in the morning and stayed until the afternoon, and then she went home and rested because Dr. Adler had been quietly clear with her that her own health required it, and then she came back in the evening. She brought books that Reese could not concentrate on and crossword puzzles that Reese completed in 20 minutes in a small frame photograph from the mantelpiece at home that she placed on the windowsill where Reese could see it from the bed. Reese, at 12 years old, standing in front of the yellow house on Decker Street, in a coat 2 sizes too large, squinting into the sun, with an expression that was not quite a smile, but contained the structural elements of one. Chloe came every day as well. She came in the afternoons after the Art Institute classes she had resumed because Reese had been insistent about it, in the direct way of someone who does not have the energy to be diplomatic about things that matter to them. Chloe would sit in the chair by the bed and talk, something she had rarely done in the months of Tuesday evenings at the diner because she was not by temperament a talker, but something in the aftermath of the reservoir had rearranged her relationship to silence, made it feel like a luxury she was no longer entirely comfortable with. She talked about the sculptures she was working on, large angular things in welded steel that her instructors found ambitious and her classmates found alarming, and that Chloe found necessary in the way that certain forms of making are necessary to certain kinds of people. She talked about her father, who visited the hospital every morning before 7 and stayed for exactly 15 minutes and did not stay longer because staying longer would have meant acknowledging something about his own interior that he was not yet ready to acknowledge. She talked about Oak Haven and what it felt like to move through the town now. "It feels like the town exhaled," she said one afternoon, sitting with her legs folded in the plastic chair, turning a steel bolt over and over in her fingers the way some people turn coins. Like it had been holding its breath for years and nobody realized until it stopped. Reese looked at the ceiling. "What about you?" she said. "Did you exhale?" Chloe was quiet for a moment. "I'm still working on it," she said. On the 8th day after surgery, lying in the pale winter light that came through the hospital room window in the mid-afternoon, Reese heard Sarah speaking in a low voice with one of the night nurses in the hallway. The conversation was not intended to be overheard. Sarah had stepped outside to give Reese a few minutes alone with her thoughts, and the door was not fully closed, and voices in hospital hallways carry in the way of spaces built for hygiene rather than acoustics. She heard the nurse mention the billing department. She heard Sarah's voice respond, quiet and controlled, asking about the outstanding balance and whether the insurance notation on file was current. She heard the nurse's answer, which was gentle in the way of people who have delivered this kind of information many times and have developed a gentleness around it that is real but insufficient. She heard numbers, She heard the phrase, payment plan options. She heard Sarah thank the nurse in the voice she used when she was holding something together by deliberate effort. Reese lay in the bed and looked at the ceiling and felt the cold that had nothing to do with the hospital's temperature move through her chest. She thought about the yellow house on Decker Street and the bills on the kitchen table and the medications that cost what they cost and the 30 hours a week she had been putting in at Harlan's Diner that were not being put in right now and would not be put in for weeks. She thought about the specific arithmetic of their lives, which she had been running in the back of her mind since she was 15, and she ran it now, and it produced results that frightened her in a way the knife had not. The knife had been a single moment. This was a weight that compounded. She did not cry. She stared at the ceiling and held the weight of the calculation and allowed herself for the first time since she had opened her eyes in the recovery room to be frightened. Not of the injury, not of the men who had caused it, but of the slower and more intractable danger of what happened to people like her and her mother when something catastrophic interrupted the precarious equilibrium they had built. When Crow came the following morning, she asked to speak with him alone. He came in at 6:50 as he always did, and Sarah and Chloe were not yet there. He sat in the chair that Sarah usually occupied, which was the first time Reese had seen him seated in the room rather than standing, and the difference in scale was notable. He was still a very large man in a very small chair, but the sitting communicated something that the standing had not a willingness to be in the space on its terms rather than his own. I need to say something, Reese said. He waited. She told him what she had heard in the hallway. She told him about the billing, about the insurance, about the numbers the nurse had mentioned. She told him about what those numbers meant against the backdrop of what their lives looked like without her income from the diner. She told him clearly and without drama the way she would have told it to a bank officer or a school counselor. Because those were the contexts in which she had learned to present difficult financial information without making it seem like a request for sympathy. Then she told him the other thing. I want to testify, she said, against all of them. Wyatt Trent Wallace Pruitt, whoever the prosecutors need. Whatever they need me to say in court, I'll say it. On record. She held his gaze. But I need to know that my mother is safe while that process is happening. I need to know that nothing reaches her while I'm doing this. She paused. I'm not asking you to do anything. I'm telling you what I'm willing to do, and I'm asking if you can make sure she's covered while I do it. Crow looked at her for a long moment. It was the look he had given her at the reservoir, the look of someone taking a careful measurement of a thing they want to be certain they are assessing accurately. Why do you want to testify? He said. Because if I don't, Reese said they find another way to make what happened disappear. They've been making things disappear in this town for 30 years. The only reason this one didn't disappear is because you showed up. She looked at him steadily. But you can't be in a courtroom, not in the way that counts. I can. Crow was quiet. He looked at his hands, which were resting on his knees, and then he looked at her face. You understand what it means to be the primary witness in a federal case against a family like the Rourkes, he said. It means your name is on record. It means you are visible in a way that creates a specific kind of vulnerability for a specific period of time. I know, Reese said. No. He nodded once slowly with the weight of a man making a decision that he intends to honor completely. Ghost and Rat will be with your mother every hour that you are not with her until the verdict comes in. No exceptions, he stood. As for the other matter, it's already done, said a voice from the doorway. A man Reese had not seen before was standing in the doorframe. He was in his late 50s, well-dressed in a way that suggested practice rather than ostentation, carrying a leather briefcase with the slightly worn quality of something that has been used seriously for a long time. He had the composed effect of a professional man who has spent his career dealing with situations that other people find overwhelming and has arrived at a functional equanimity about them. Dr. Leonard Marsh, the man said, stepping into the room. He directed this at Sarah, who had appeared behind him in the doorway, and then he looked at Reese. I'm an autoimmune specialist. I'm based in Los Angeles, and I work on private retainer. He set the briefcase on the chair and opened it and removed a folder. Your mother's condition has been reviewed by my office based on her existing medical records, which were provided to me this morning. I'd like to start with a full consultation this week if she's willing. Sarah was in the doorway with her coat on and her hands folded and her face doing the thing it did when she was processing something that exceeded the category she had prepared for processing. "Mr. Miller," she said, "we don't have the resources for a specialist of this." Crow held up one hand. He did it gently. "Sarah," he said, and the gentleness in his voice when he said her name was something that Reese filed carefully away. "When I told you that this club owed your family a debt, I was not speaking in metaphors. I don't speak in metaphors." He let a moment pass. "A blind trust has been established in Reese's name. It covers this hospital and every bill associated with this stay. It covers Dr. Marsh's retainer for your care. It covers Reese's tuition at whatever school she chooses to attend." He paused. "It covers the house on Decker Street for as long as you both need it covered. The debt is absolute, and this is how debts are paid." Sarah looked at him. Her face held for a moment the expression of a woman who has spent 20 years solving problems alone and is encountering for the first time the experience of a problem being solved by someone else, and the experience is so unfamiliar that it takes a full breath to process as real. Then she looked at her daughter. Reese was looking at the Zippo on the bedside table. She had been looking at it since the morning Crow had put it there, the way you look at something that represents a shift in the way you understand the world, not constantly, but returning to it each time, finding that it has not moved, and that it continues to mean what it meant the first time you saw it. "Thank you," Sarah said finally. It was all she said, but she said it in a voice that meant a great deal more than those two words typically carry. The weeks that followed had their own texture, which was the texture of recovery, physical and otherwise. Dr. Adler had been clear with Reese about the timeline. The surgical repairs needed time to consolidate. The bowel injury required a careful and graduated return to normal function. She was to do nothing strenuous, to eat carefully, to sleep more than she wanted to, and to resist the impulse to return to the diner before she was genuinely ready, which would be several weeks at the earliest. Bud Castor, who had received a visit from Dutch Holloway early in the morning after the hospital siege, had agreed without much deliberation to hold Reese's position open indefinitely and to cover her lost wages during the recovery period, an agreement he honored without complaint and apparently without resentment, which said something about the conversation with Dutch that Bud had elected not to discuss with anyone. Ghost Harrison and Rat Corcoran maintained their vigil at the end of the hospital hallway, and then when Reese was discharged and returned to Decker Street, extended their operation to the neighborhood. They were not visible in the theatrical sense. They did not sit on the front porch or park a motorcycle in the driveway. But they were present in the way that a perimeter is present, and Sarah, who had grown up in a world where protection was an abstract concept associated with the institutions that had never much protected people like her, adjusted to it with the practical acceptance of a woman who has learned to use what is available. Deputy Carl Pruitt had not been among the people arrested in the initial federal sweep. He was a secondary figure in the Rourke network, his name appearing in the accounting records in connection with payments recorded as consulting fees that required a level of forensic accounting to trace that the initial phase of the investigation had not yet reached. He was still in the week after the arrests, a credentialed law enforcement officer in Oak Haven County, though the department itself was in an administrative chaos that made the execution of his actual duties largely notional. Pruitt was 44 years old and had spent 19 of those years doing what Dale Harmon and Wallace Rourke needed him to do, and he had built a life around the assumption that the architecture supporting that arrangement was stable. The arrests had not destroyed that assumption gradually. They had destroyed it all at once in a single night, and what remained in Pruitt was the desperation of a man who can see exactly what is coming toward him and believes that the only variable still within his control is whether there is a witness available to confirm the final piece of evidence against him. He knew what Reese Mitchell had seen on the access road. He had been in that cruiser. He had seen the girl on the ground and the blood on the asphalt and the look on Chloe Miller's face. And he had made the choice he had made, and he had driven away, and he had believed on the basis of 30 years of evidence that certain things in Oak Haven did not have consequences, that the choice would remain where he had left it on that frozen road in the dark. He believed this until the federal subpoenas began arriving, until his name appeared in the investigative records forwarded to his attorney. until he understood through the arithmetic of federal conspiracy charges that a single witness testimony placing him at the scene and describing his deliberate departure could constitute the difference between a situation he might negotiate and a situation he could not. He did not do what an intelligent person would have done, which was to engage an attorney and cooperate with the federal investigation in exchange for a consideration on sentencing. He was not in this moment an intelligent person. He was a frightened one, which is a different category entirely. He found Sarah Mitchell at the Oak Haven Public Library on a Wednesday afternoon in December, 3 weeks after the arrests. Sarah had resumed her volunteer schedule at the library the week before, partly because Dr. Marsh had told her that maintaining regular activity was beneficial to her condition, and partly because the library was the place where she felt most herself, surrounded by the order of books on shelves, the quiet of a space dedicated to the transmission of what people have learned. She was reshelving a cart of returned books in the 900 section when Pruitt came in. He was not in uniform. He had worn civilian clothes and a baseball cap, which was the kind of precaution that suggests more self-awareness than wisdom. He found her in the aisle, and he stood at the end of it, and he waited until she turned and saw him, and then he walked to her and placed a manila envelope on the cart beside the book she was holding. He did not say much, he said enough. He told her who he was. He told her what the envelope contained. He told her what he wanted. His voice was low and controlled in the way of people who are performing control over something that is escaping them. And Sarah stood in the library aisle with a book about the Korean War in her hands and looked at him with an expression that he could not read and that he misinterpreted as fear, which was not what it was. What it was clarity. Sarah Mitchell had spent 20 years being afraid of the wrong things, and she had learned through that education to distinguish fear from understanding. And what she felt in the library aisle was understanding, the clear and specific understanding of what was happening and what it meant and what needed to happen next. She told Reese that evening. Reese was sitting at the kitchen table on Decker Street with a cup of tea. She was not drinking, still moving with the careful economy of someone managing a healing wound. Sarah sat across from her and told her plainly what had happened in the library, what the envelope contained. Photographs of the house of Sarah's library schedule, of the route she walked from the parking lot to the entrance, and what Pruitt had said. She told it without inflection, the way she had learned to tell difficult things. Then she put the envelope on the table between them and waited. Reese looked at the envelope. She did not open it. She picked up her tea and held it in both hands and was quiet for a long time. And Sarah did not fill the silence because she had learned something over the years about her daughter's silences, that they were not empty, that they were working silences, and that interrupting them produced worse outcomes than waiting them out. Reese set the cup down. She looked at her mother's face. "I need to make a call," she said. She called Crow from the back porch, standing in the December cold in her fleece jacket, with the wound pulling tightly against her ribs when she breathed too deeply. She told him what had happened in the same spare language she had used in the hospital room, clearly, without editorializing, giving him the information in the order in which it was useful. She told him about Pruitt. She told him about the envelope. She told him what she understood Pruitt's calculation to be and why it was wrong. Then she said, "I'm still testifying. Everything I told you before still stands. I need you to know that this doesn't change it." She paused. "What changes is that my mother needs to be covered every hour from now until the verdict. Not just most hours, every hour." There was a brief silence on the line. Then Crow said, "Done." And then, "He won't get near her again." Ghost Harrison was at the library the following Wednesday, arriving before Sarah and parking across the street in a vehicle that was not a motorcycle. He was there when Sarah arrived, and he was there when she left, and she did not acknowledge his presence directly because he had asked her not to, and she understood the logic of that. He was there the Wednesday after that as well. Pruitt made his second approach on a Thursday morning outside the parking lot of the medical clinic where Sarah had an appointment with Dr. Marsh. He came on foot from the direction of the adjacent street, wearing the same civilian clothes and the same baseball cap, and he had his phone out in the way of someone recording something, and he had covered perhaps 20 feet of the distance between the street and the clinic entrance, when Ghost Harrison materialized from the space between two parked cars with the noiseless arrival that had earned him his name. What happened in the parking lot took approximately 45 seconds and was not observed by anyone in a position to provide an account that would have been admissible in any court. What was observable afterward was that Pruitt was in the back of an unmarked vehicle with a broken wrist and the contents of his phone no longer in his possession, and that he was delivered to the federal building in Sacramento 3 hours later by two men who left before anyone inside could get their names. And that Pruitt, upon arrival, asked immediately to speak with a federal prosecutor about a cooperation agreement. He spoke with federal prosecutors for 11 hours over 2 days. He told them about the reservoir access road. He told them about the call from Harmon and what Harmon had asked him to do and what he had done. He told them about the payments and the consultancies and the long architecture of accommodation that had made a man like Dale Harmon possible in a place like Oak Haven. He told them all of it with the comprehensive thoroughness of a man who has decided that the only asset remaining to him is information and who intends to realize its full value. The prosecutors added 8 years to the charges against Pruitt for witness tampering and criminal threatening. The cooperation agreement reduced his own exposure by a portion of that which his attorney described as the best available outcome, which is the kind of description that contains its own assessment of how badly things had gone. Reese did not learn the details of what happened in the parking lot until considerably later, when Chloe told her matter-of-factly in the way of someone reporting a completed task. She absorbed the information the way she had absorbed most of what had happened in the preceding months, noting it, filing it, understanding its implications, and then returning to the work of recovery, which was the work most immediately in front of her. The federal court proceedings against the Rourke family and the former officers of the Oak Haven Sheriff's Department moved through the system with the methodical pace of serious federal cases, deliberate document heavy, requiring a patience that the judicial process enforces, regardless of the emotional urgency of the people involved in it. By the time the trial date arrived 6 months after the night at the reservoir, Reese Mitchell was no longer a patient and no longer an invalid, and no longer the girl from the yellow house on Decker Street who had learned to be invisible in order to survive. She was something she was still in the process of naming, but its outlines were becoming clear. The Oak Haven County Federal Courthouse had been built in the 1950s with the architectural aspirations of a small county that believed in the gravity of civic institutions. It had wood paneling and high ceilings, and the smell of federal buildings, paper and old wood, and the faint chemical neutrality of institutional cleaning. On the morning that Reese Mitchell took the stand, the courtroom was at capacity. There were reporters. There were federal officers. There were people from Oak Haven who had driven 40 minutes to the county seat because they needed to see this particular thing happen in person. Reese wore a dark blazer over a white shirt. She had bought the blazer 2 weeks earlier at a consignment store in Sacramento because she had understood instinctively that what she wore in that room would be read as a statement about who she was, and she wanted the statement to be legible. The surgical scar beneath her shirt pulled tightly when she sat down in the witness chair and settled her posture, and she adjusted slightly, and then she was still. The Zippo was in her jacket pocket. She could feel its weight against her left side, precise and familiar, the weight of something that had been placed there deliberately and that she had chosen to keep. Wyatt and Trent Rourke sat at the defense table in the dark suits that their attorneys had provided. Wyatt looked smaller than Reese remembered him, not physically smaller, but dimensionally reduced the arrogance that had given him his size, compressed by 6 months of federal holding into something flattened and dull. He did not look at her when she entered the courtroom. Trent looked at her once and then looked at the table in front of him and did not look at her again. Wallace Rourke was at a separate table, the charges against him having been severed for a separate proceeding, and he sat with his attorney and stared at the middle distance with the expression of a man who has stopped expecting the situation to improve. The prosecutor walked Reese through the events of the night at the reservoir with the methodical care of someone laying a foundation meant to hold a great deal of weight. Reese answered each question with the same directness she had brought to every difficult conversation of her adult life. She described what she had seen, what she had done, what had been done to her. She described the sound of the switchblade engaging. She described the movement toward Chloe and the decision that had not felt, in the moment, like a decision at all. The defense attorney, when his turn came, attempted several constructions. He suggested that the situation at the bonfire had been a mutual altercation. He suggested that Reese's intervention had been the precipitating act that escalated the confrontation. He suggested that the events had been characterized in the aftermath through the distorting lens of a community narrative that serves certain interests. Reese listened to each construction with the patience of someone who is not threatened by incorrect framings because they have the correct one and know how to hold it. When the attorney had finished, she looked at the jury. 12 people, a cross-section of the county, looking back at her with the attentiveness of people who understand that what happens in the next few minutes will matter. He was going to stab a 16-year-old girl, she said. Her voice was level and clear and reached the back of the courtroom without effort. I stepped in the way. She paused, and in the pause she could feel the weight of the Zippo in her pocket and the pull of the scar against her ribs when she breathed. I would do it again tomorrow. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. Wallace Rourke received 25 years in federal prison for racketeering, public corruption, and money laundering. His attorneys had argued for leniency on the basis of his age and his prior civic contributions, which the federal judge reviewed and then declined to find persuasive. Trent received 10 years for his role in the narcotics operation and for his actions at the reservoir. Wyatt stood when the judge read his sentence, 15 years, no possibility of parole, for attempted murder in the first degree, and the sound he made when the gavel came down was not a word. It was something below language, something produced by a body receiving information it cannot process through normal channels. The bailiffs moved to either side of him, and he did not resist, and they walked him out through the side door, and the door closed behind him. Dale Harmon received 12 years for conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and abuse of public trust. Carl Pruitt, whose cooperation had been factored into his sentencing recommendation, received 8 years with credit for time served and a reduction for substantial assistance. His attorney presented this as a favorable outcome. Pruitt did not appear to experience it as one. In the gallery in the front row, Clayton Crow Miller sat in a black suit that had been made for him by a tailor in Oakland who understood the dimensions of the man and the occasion. He wore no colors. He wore a small lapel pin, the winged death's head, silver, barely visible against the black lapel. Chloe sat to his left. Sarah sat to his right in a coat she had bought new for the occasion, her posture straight and her hands folded in her lap, and her eyes, for most of the proceedings, on her daughter. When the verdicts were read and the gallery began to move and the reporters headed for the exits to file their pieces, Crow remained seated for a moment. He sat with his hands on his knees and looked at the empty defense table, and then at the closed side door through which Wyatt Rourke had been walked, and his expression held the quality of a completed accounting. Not satisfaction, because satisfaction implies a warmth that was not present, but the recognition of a balance brought into a kind of order. He stood. He put on his sunglasses. He put one hand briefly on Sarah Mitchell's shoulder as he moved toward the aisle, a touch that lasted less than 2 seconds, and said what it needed to say. Then he walked out of the courtroom, and the people in the gallery moved aside as he passed, and he did not appear to notice this, which was perhaps the most authoritative thing about him. Corcoran State Prison occupied a flat expanse of land in the Central Valley 40 miles from the coast, where the summer heat was absolute and the winter fog was absolute, and the seasons in between were a negotiation between these two absolutes that produced nothing comfortable. It was a level 4 maximum security facility housing the most serious offenders in the California state system, which meant that it housed people whose primary credential was the thing they had been willing to do that others had not, and that the social organization within its walls reflected this with the brutal consistency of a system that has no incentive toward refinement. Wyatt Rourke arrived at Corcoran on a Tuesday morning in March, transported in a federal vehicle with 4 other inmates processing through intake, with the dazed compliance of someone whose body is performing the required actions while the mind has not fully accepted the location. He had been told by his attorney and by the few people at Corcoran with whom he had managed to make contact through the prison's correspondence system before his arrival that he would be approached by the Aryan Brotherhood within his first week and offered protection, which was the standard arrangement for young white inmates of his background and profile. He walked out onto the level 4 yard for the first time on his third day. The yard was a rectangle of sun-baked asphalt surrounded by razor wire and gun towers, populated in the way of maximum security yards, clusters of men arranged by affiliation. The geography of the space encoding the social structure of the population, with a legibility that required no explanation to anyone who spent 5 minutes observing it. Wyatt had been told to look for a man named Briggs who ran the Brotherhood's operation in the yard to identify himself and to make the standard offer of financial consideration in exchange for protection. He stepped into the yard and the door closed behind him, and he stood in the thin March sunlight and looked for Briggs. He noticed after a moment the yard's silence. It was not the silence of a yard that had not yet noticed him. It was a silence that had noticed him very thoroughly and had made prior to his arrival a series of decisions about how to respond to his presence. The clusters of men he could see from where he stood were oriented subtly but unmistakably away from him. The Brotherhood group at the far end of the yard had their backs turned with a deliberateness that communicated intention. The other groups were similarly positioned. He was standing in the center of a yard containing 200 men who had collectively elected to be looking somewhere else. A shadow fell across the asphalt in front of him. Slider Jenkins was serving a double life sentence, which meant he had arrived at a relationship with time and consequence that was different in kind from anything Wyatt Rourke had experienced or was capable of imagining. He was broad and unhurried, and his face carried the topography of a life that had included a great deal of violence, not as an aberration, but as a medium through which he had moved for decades. The ink on his neck was dense and specific, the kind of ink that tells a complete story to people who can read it. He looked at Wyatt with the expression of a man examining something that occupies an interesting position in a taxonomy he has spent years developing. "Sullivan," he said. Rourke Wyatt said instinctively, a correction that died in his throat as he said it. Slider looked at him. He did not move in any threatening way. He simply stood with his hands at his sides and looked, and the looking was its own form of pressure. "Word came down from Crow Miller on the outside," Slider said. His voice was low and textured, shaped by decades of speaking in exactly this kind of register. "You pulled a blade on his daughter. You put a knife in a kid who wears our protection." He paused. "You understand what that means in here." Wyatt understood with the speed of a person whose understanding of certain things had been radically accelerated by the preceding months, that the offer of financial consideration he had been preparing to make was not going to be relevant. He understood that the Brotherhood's turnbacks had not been accidental. He understood that the silence in the yard was a structured thing, a prepared thing arranged before he arrived. "Please," he said. The word came out with more candor than he intended. He felt the youth of himself very acutely in that moment, the 21 years of a life constructed on foundations that had not held. "I'm sorry. Tell them I'm sorry. Please." Slider looked at him for a long moment. Then he crouched down easily with the flexibility of a man who maintains himself so that his face was at Wyatt's level, and he spoke at a volume that was only for the two of them. "We're not going to kill you today," he said. His voice was entirely without emotion, which was more frightening than any intensity could have been. "We're not going to kill you tomorrow." He paused. "Murder is a release. You don't get off that easy." He looked at Wyatt's face with the patient attention of someone making sure the information is reaching its destination. "For the next 15 years, every time you close your eyes in that cell, you're going to ask yourself if tonight is the night. Every time you step into this yard, you're going to wonder about the man behind you." He paused again. "We own your breath. We own your sleep. Every morning you wake up because we decided to let you." He stood up. "Welcome to the rest of your life." He turned and walked away. The yard returned to its ordinary sounds, the ambient noise of many men in a contained space, conversations and footsteps, and the distant radio from one of the guard stations. Wyatt was left standing alone in the center of the asphalt, in the thin March sunlight, and no one in the yard would look at him. And he understood that this was not going to change. 4 years dissolved in the way that time dissolves when the structure supporting it has been comprehensively altered. Oak Haven changed slowly and unevenly, the way places change, when the force that has been shaping them is removed not through sudden transformation, but through the gradual reassertion of what had been suppressed, the filling in of spaces that power had kept empty for its own purposes. New businesses opened on the south side of the tracks. The school board, reconstituted after the removal of two members whose connections to the Rourke family had been documented in the federal proceedings, made decisions based on different criteria. The new sheriff appointed in the interim and subsequently elected was a woman from the Central Valley who had spent 15 years in the state police and who regarded the Oak Haven position as an opportunity to do a specific job rather than as an infrastructure for a different kind of enterprise. The yellow house on Decker Street had a new porch support post properly installed the left side of the porch level for the first time in years. Sarah Mitchell no longer needed to conserve her energy in the careful, calculated way of someone whose resources are finite and unpredictable. Dr. Marsh's treatment protocols had produced results that he described in his notes as among the most responsive he had observed in his practice, which in the careful language of clinical documentation was a significant statement. She volunteered at the library 4 days a week and had developed a particular expertise in helping the library's after-school program acquire the books that kids in the neighborhood actually wanted to read, which turned out to be a curatorial skill she was very good at. Reese Mitchell was 21 years old and was in her third year of a pre-law program at the University of California, Sacramento. She had entered the program at 19 after a year of recovery and preparation that she had used with the same focused intensity she had brought to everything else: reading, studying, building the foundation that the program would require. She was not the youngest student in her class or the oldest, and she was not the most traditionally credentialed, and she was consistently among the most prepared, which her professors had observed with the appreciation of people who have spent careers distinguishing between students who perform preparation and students who actually conduct it. She drove back to Oak Haven every weekend, leaving Sacramento on Friday evenings after her last class, and taking the back road through the eastern hills rather than the interstate, because the back road was better, and because the drive was something she had come to value for what it contained: the open country between the city and the valley, the sky above the ridgeline, the quality of the air when the elevation changed. She rode a Harley-Davidson Dynaglide, a 1998 model that had been restored with evident care and the kind of mechanical attention that produces something worth keeping. It had appeared in the driveway on Decker Street on her 18th birthday, a month after the trial ended, the keys hanging from a silver skull keychain, no note attached, no explanation required. She wore her hair differently now, down when she wasn't riding, pulled back with a simple clip rather than the functional ponytail of her diner years. She had the same brown attentive eyes and the same stillness, but the stillness had a different character than it had at 17. At 17, the stillness had been a survival strategy, a technique of invisibility. At 21, it was something she had chosen: the stillness of a person who has decided what they are paying attention to and does not require external noise to feel present. When she walked through the heavy steel door of the Hells Angels clubhouse on the eastern edge of Oak Haven, the music dropped. Not because anyone signaled for it to drop, not through any organized protocol. It happened the way it happened every Friday evening. She came through that door organically, spontaneously, the sound in the room adjusting itself to acknowledge the presence of a person toward whom the room had a particular orientation. Men who had served decades in the California penal system nodded at her. Dutch Holloway, who was not a man given to unnecessary demonstrations of anything, brought her a cup of coffee without being asked. Ghost Harrison, who said very little to anyone at any time, said her name when she came in, which was his version of a full greeting. She was not a member. She did not wear colors. She was something the club's formal taxonomy did not have a precise category for: a civilian who had bled for the patch, and whom the patch had chosen in return to protect with the totality of its resources. And she moved through that space with the ease of someone who genuinely belonged to it. Chloe was finishing her final year at the Art Institute. She had developed a reputation in the regional arts community for large-scale welded steel sculptures that critics described with words like uncompromising and technically demanding and occasionally terrifying, which Chloe found accurate. She and Reese existed in the space that had been growing between them since the Tuesday evenings at Harlan's Diner, a space that had been deepened by blood and by time into something that resisted the available labels being more than friendship, indifferent in kind from romance, a bond produced by the specific experience of having been at the point where everything was on the line and having chosen at that point each other. Chloe had a studio in Sacramento now, near the campus, and Reese's apartment was 10 minutes away. And this proximity had become a fact of their lives that neither of them discussed because neither of them needed to discuss it. It simply was. Crow Miller was 51 years old and had not materially changed externally in the 4 years since the night at the reservoir. The same massive frame, the same dense ink, the same face that had learned to give away only what it chose to give away. What had changed in ways visible only to people who knew him well was something in the area of expectation. He had spent 40 years in a world that operated on a specific set of principles, and those principles had served him and the people around him in the ways that such principles serve people who live by them. But there was something different now in the way he sat in the clubhouse on Friday evenings when Reese Mitchell came through the door, a quality of attention that was not merely protective, but something closer to what you might call pride, if you were willing to use that word about Clayton Crow Miller, which most people were not. On a Friday evening in late October, 4 years after the reservoir, Reese was riding back from Sacramento on the back road through the eastern hills. The night was clear and cold, the sky above the ridgeline thick with stars, the high beams of the Dynaglide cutting through the dark. Her constitutional law casebook was in the saddlebag. She had been annotating it on the campus lawn that afternoon, sitting in the last of the October sun. And she had marked 32 pages with the small, precise notations that were her version of thinking on paper. The gas station appeared at the junction where the back road met Route 9, a small outpost of fluorescent light in the surrounding dark, the two pumps casting long shadows across the cracked concrete apron. She pulled in and cut the engine and dismounted and began the process of filling the tank, her breath fogging slightly in the cold air. The sound of another engine reached her before the headlights did. Not a motorcycle, a car arriving slowly, which was itself a quality she noted without turning around, because slow arrivals at empty gas stations at 11 at night had a different character than purposeful arrivals. She heard the car stop behind her. She heard the door open. She heard footsteps on the concrete, measured and deliberate. She did not turn around immediately. She finished what she was doing with the pump, settled her posture, and then she turned. Crow was leaning against the front of a dark truck parked beside the second pump. His arms crossed, his sunglasses off, watching her. Dutch was beside him. Ghost Harrison was at the edge of the light, which was his preferred position, and which Reese had learned to check for before assuming she was alone in a space. There was no emergency in the postures of any of them. This was not a rescue. This was a meeting, arranged in the way that certain meetings are arranged by people who don't need to call ahead, because the appropriate moment is something they recognize when it arrives. They came to her, she realized. They had known her route and her schedule, and had arranged to be here at this junction on this particular night with a deliberateness that had nothing accidental in it. She stood by the pump with the fuel nozzle still in her hand and looked at Crow, and he looked at her, and the 4 years between the reservoir and this gas station were in the space between them fully present, everything that had happened in them, neither absent nor needing to be referenced, because it was simply there. Crow reached into the inside pocket of his cut. He removed something and held it out. It was not an envelope, not a document, not a piece of paper. It was a leather patch, the winged death's head, worked in the specific configuration of the California Charter, with a backing that indicated it was meant to be sewn rather than pinned. It was the full patch. Reese looked at it in his outstretched hand. She looked at his face. "You've earned the right to ask for this," he said. His voice carried no pressure. He said it in the way of someone presenting a fact, which was how he said things when they were true, and he wanted them received as true rather than as persuasion. You've got the blood, you've got the heart, you've got the kind of loyalty that most people who wear this never actually arrive at. He paused. A year prospecting and you'd have the full patch. Nobody in this country would be able to look at you twice. Reese held the patch in her gaze for a long moment. She felt the weight of the Zippo in her jacket pocket, the weight she had felt every day for 4 years. The weight she had not removed because she had not wanted to remove it, and she understood that the Zippo and the patch were part of the same accounting, and that she was being asked now to bring that accounting to a specific conclusion. She looked at the saddlebag on the Dynaglide where the constitutional law casebook was sitting, with its 32 annotated pages, and she thought about the courtroom in Oak Haven County, and the 12 people in the jury box, and the federal judge with his gavel, and the specific way that the law, real law applied with actual integrity, had been able to do what it was supposed to do once the conditions for its application had been restored. She thought about what those conditions had required and who had restored them and at what cost. She thought about the federal prosecutors who had needed her testimony. She thought about every person in Oak Haven who had been unable to get justice through legitimate channels because the channels had been corrupted, and about what it would have meant to have someone in those channels who understood from the inside the anatomy of that corruption. You already have enough muscle, she said. She said it without apology and without the hedging that diminishes things. What you don't have is someone who can tear a federal prosecutor's case to shreds in a tailored jacket. Someone who knows what's in that ledger and what it means and how to use it. She held his gaze. That's the more valuable thing, Crow. That's what lasts longer than muscle. Dutch looked at Ghost. Ghost looked at the middle distance, which was his response to most things. Crow stood very still. He looked at Reese Mitchell, the girl from the diner, the girl on the Reservoir Road, the girl who had been on his daughter's phone in the worst moment of his life, and who had turned out to be something he had not anticipated and could not have engineered and would not have wanted to engineer, because what she was had to be arrived at freely to be what it actually was. He looked at her standing at the gas pump on the junction of the back road and Route 9 with the cold October air around her and the stars above the ridge and the casebook in her saddlebag and the Zippo in her pocket. And something moved across his face that the people who knew him best would have recognized as the rarest thing he produced, which was uncalculated feeling. Then he threw his head back and laughed. It was a large sound, Crow's laugh, when it came genuinely large, unperformed, filling the space around the gas station, with the sound of a man who was surprised and who was beneath the surprise deeply and uncomplicatedly pleased. He brought his head back down and looked at her with an expression she had seen in pieces over the years, but never quite assembled into this configuration. A lawyer, he said. He shook his head once still with the remnant of the laugh in it. He put the patch back inside his cut. Then he reached out and put his large hand on her shoulder, the same shoulder he had touched in the courthouse corridor 4 years before, brief and deliberate, saying what it said. I like that better. She looked at him, then she looked at Dutch, who was showing something in his face that on another man she would have called a smile. Then she looked at Ghost, who was looking at the ridge and giving nothing away, which was Ghost. She hung the fuel nozzle back on the pump. She zipped her jacket against the cold. She swung her leg over the Dynaglide and settled into the seat and felt the familiar architecture of the machine beneath her. The weight, the balance, the solidity of something built to last and maintained with care. She kicked the starter. The engine turned over and caught the exhaust note of the twin cam filling the cold air around the junction with a sound that was not loud in any aggressive sense, but was entirely present, the sound of something that has found its register and intends to stay in it. She pulled out of the gas station and onto Route 9 and opened the throttle, the headlight cutting through the dark toward Oak Haven, toward the yellow house on Decker Street, toward her mother reading in the living room under the good light, toward the future that had been bought at a specific price by specific people on a specific night 4 years ago, and that she intended to spend wisely and at length and with full knowledge of what it had cost.